I'm gonna record it now.
We ready?
Yes.
I was so comfortable until I had to click share 6 times, and then I got stressed out because it wasn't working. But anyhow, here we go. Can you all see tank maintenance? What is routine and what is extra? Thanks for inviting me, DFW Mass. Some of you might know me and some of you probably don't. My name is Duane Oestreich. I've been keeping fish since the late 80s. I did freshwater for 17 years. And back in 2005, I switched over to saltwater and started off with SPS. This is my current tank as it stood in November. I've done a little bit of pruning since then. And I've developed a reputation for growing large SPS tanks. And typically when they grow about this big, I tear them all the way down to bare rock and start over. So I've developed this reputation of just kind of burn it all down and start over. And since I have a large support system, I'm able to put large colonies back in. And that about 6 months later, you can't really tell that I destroyed it all. This is a tank from probably 6 years ago. I believe it got a Reef to Reef Tank of the Month write-up back then. And when I look back on it, I don't really think it deserved a Tank of the Month write-up. It was not nearly as impressive as what we're capable of doing nowadays with the technology we have and with the maintenance routines I've developed throughout the years. Another one, I think that was back in 2012, and they just keep going on and on. So I would say, well, let's get the presentation started. This is, wanted to share, I'm probably the only person in the Pacific Northwest sporting your guys' club's logo and bumper sticker. So that's on my truck. I also have one on my tank room wall. So thanks for sharing those when you guys had the Aquashella down there. So let's get started. Do you have the right equipment to maintain your tank the way it should be maintained? As you can see here, I have a respirator on. I was doing some heavy duty cleaning using muriatic acid. So sticking my head in a 90-gallon tank full of muriatic acid is never a good thing to do without some sort of serious measures, heavy gloves, long sleeve shirts, and my respirator. Some of the things that we take for granted are, bone shears, nets. I use bottle brushes, toothbrushes, little wire whisks, turkey basters, a lot of kitchen stuff, believe it or not, works really well for a lot of the stuff we do. I'm lucky enough to have a kitchen sink right there, a little utility sink with my fish tank that's built into my laundry room. So my wife has to suffer with the mess that's usually there. More stuff that we use, of course, is salinity testers. I don't have any swing arm hydrometers anymore. I've kind of moved up from that, but you can use pretty much anything you want that's consistent. Consistency is always the key. Again, consistency and routine is important. I have a variety of glass and acrylic cleaners because I have both glass and acrylic tanks in my system. I try to keep up on it and, of course, sometimes fall behind. Testing is important for most of us. I have to admit, honestly, that every one of these test kits, other than the Phosphate RX, which is an additive, is expired because I am horrible about testing for phosphate and nitrate. My system's been built into the wall for 15 years, and I'm pretty comfortable with those levels being where I expect them because I have a really rigid feeding routine and water change schedule. I turkey baste my sand bed. I don't count on the fish to stir my sand bed for me. So I make sure to keep those levels down by doing my routine. And I've just given up on testing because they were always little to none in my nitrate and phosphates. If you have probes, then you need calibration solutions so you can keep up on those. I typically calibrate my probes every few months. Just because the numbers look good doesn't mean I trust that they're where they're supposed to be. And then some of the other things you might need is, as you can see, I have a big shop vac that I use. The muriatic acid there. I keep a step ladder. I have several step ladders actually, because my tanks are, some of them are 6.5 feet tall to the rim, and I have to get up and into them. I use coolers, childhood storage bins. That's my son's old toy storage bins that have been retired from him growing up that I keep along for the ride. Is great for muriatic acid, vinegar. I actually bleach quite a few things when I'm doing my routine cleaning, and towels, as you can see in the corner, lots of towels, because it's a very wet cleaning and wet stuff we do. More coolers, lots of coolers. Extra heaters and power heads come in handy when you're doing larger jobs. As you can see there, that's one of my routine cleanings. And that's some of the stuff that we use when it comes to maintenance on our tanks. There's so many more things. There's just a few of the things that I gathered up just for the presentation here. I'm sure you guys have stuff that I never would have thought of. So if you can think of something that would help me, feel free to share at the end of the presentation. I would appreciate it. So the next subject is, do you keep a schedule? I sure do. I'm very rigid about the things I do. Some things I do daily, some things weekly, some things I actually do annually. And even when it comes to like cleaning my sump, an idea I got from Mark Levinson, I clean my sump out every 3rd year, whether I think it or needs it or not. So on with keeping a schedule. Like I said, I use the Apex Fusion, and this is just an example of some of the things I do in 1 month. So this is what's coming up for me in the month of February. Water changes, Kalkwasser, I do every week. At the end of the month, I'll have to change the carbon and clean my power heads. I will calibrate my refractometer, because it's just a good practice to do, whether you do it every time you use it or whether you do it weekly or monthly. You just calibrate. Don't trust that your electronics are doing what they're supposed to be doing. Keep up on that. So I try to do ICP testing occasionally. A couple of years ago, you'll notice in 2018 and 19, I was a little bit better about it. I wasn't doing water changes, so I was actually dosing trace minerals, and I wanted to make sure that my potassium, strontium, all of those trace minerals weren't getting out of whack. Since then, I've gone back to regular water changes every 2 weeks, so I've stopped worrying so much about ICP testing, because I assume that the salt that I use has parameters where I want them to be. Cleaning your glass, scraping with an algae-free magnet or a razor blade's important. As you can see, I let it get away from me here. This is actually the cause of having too small of a flipper magnet. I use that small magnet because of my aquascaping allows the corals to grow bigger. They grow closer to the glass on the backside of my tank in my laundry room. So I'm not able to clean it, but I do break out a handy blade, a razor blade, and I clean that glass about once a month when it gets away from me. And you can see I picked up the little bit of the anacropora that had fallen off and was laying there slowly dying and clouding the tank. I cleaned it up too. So not the perfect before and after picture representation, but gets the point across. Without a routine maintenance and routine testing, this is what happens. You end up with Valonia everywhere because of phosphate getting out of control. Aptasia too. This is an after. This is an after effect of me letting that tank getting out of control, not keeping up on my routine water changes, siphoning detritus. The phosphate got out of control. My refugium, I believe, wasn't doing well at the time. And I paid the price by doing hours of extra work. And again, there's a nice, fresh, clean frag rack that's benefits from routine maintenance. Again, part of my routine, like I said, annually, I clean those frag racks, then frag tanks, or more after effects. Routine also could include weekly changing your Cato reactor. When my Cato reactor was doing well, every 5 days I would have to completely empty it. That was so full that I literally almost would break it pulling it out of the reactor. It would be so full of Cato. In my experience, Cato is that kind of algae that's going 140% or it's withering back and dying. So ultimately, I got rid of that reactor and went with the refugium again, which is for me was a little bit easier to maintain. I have, as you can see, I have enough footprint that I was able to put a 20-gallon tank in that spot instead of the Cato. Cleaning probes is important. I hope you guys clean your probes regularly. As you can see, this one was neglected for a long time. This is all before I started keeping that calendar that keeps me in check, reminds me to get that muriatic acid out or vinegar, depending on how severe it all is. That's a temperature probe, by the way, and a salinity probe in the back that I wasn't really focused on. I was really just kind of shocked at how badly this was, how bad I let it go. Part of my routine is cutting corals. Sometimes they're a little strong with the shears, so I keep my hammer and chisel handy. Part of my maintenance, more tools I use. And as you can see, then I keep them in the tub there and let them cure. One thing that a lot of us forget about is routine maintenance on our backup power supply. I have a large generator built into my house. As you can see, the switches there, second down the tank, dedicated circuits for my 210. I fire that generator up every month and run it, not for me, but for when the power goes out when I'm at work. I know that my son and my wife aren't going to struggle, that it's going to fire right up for them, and that just keeps the carburetor and everything lubricated. So those are some of the regular routine things I do. Like I said, just the regular water changes, keeping up on the glass cleaning, your testing. There's a lot more to it. We all know that. My tank is built into my house and plumbed in, so I didn't go into siphon hoses and buckets, stuff like that. But you all know that. So, is this part of your routine? The day I was asked to do this presentation, I was working on my tank, and within 20 minutes of being asked, I was thinking of a topic, and I knew right away what it was going to be. This is actually a small 1/4-inch line that goes from my skimmer collection cup into an overflow bin, and it was almost completely plugged. It hadn't been working well, and at that point I replaced it. I tried to flush it out with water. It just wouldn't flush. It's 2 feet long. There's no way I was going to clean it, so I just had to just throw it away and put a new one on there. This is my overflow box, um, full of Aptasia, fermented snails. It started leaking. Not part of my regular routine, but something that happened and something I had to deal with. I ended up buying an overflow box from a friend of mine right here and had to install it. It was pretty stressful, thinking I was going to have to drain my tank down halfway full of all these corals. And I assumed this project was going to take me 4 to 6 hours to change out the bulkheads, clean it up. I was really concerned that all those SPS were going to just be sliming and possibly, cloud the water in the rest of the system and cause massive die-off. Due to good preparation, I was able to have the project done in about 2.5 hours and was filling water back up. There was quite a bit of slime, but I had 0 die-off, got lucky. But I was shocked at what I found inside of my overflow box when I took those pipes out. Like I said, Aptasia, vermeted snails, several kinds of sponge, just a mess. So always a good idea to poke your head in there once every few years and maybe grab that shop vac out, clean some of that detritus out of there. A byproduct of that leaky overflow box was salt creep everywhere. I ended up for 6 months afterwards having salt creep welling up out of the frame of that tank, and I was trying to turkey based RO water into it, clean it up, and no matter how much I flushed it out with water and dried it out, it kept coming back, and it ate the paint away, it rotted that wood out. So ultimately I ended up having to rebuild the wood and re-sheetrock it. As you can see underneath there, underneath that raw sheetrock, is the paint's all scratched up. That's from a pair of kittens trying to get in there, get up to look at the tank when they were young and curious. So they would hang onto the rim, the wood rim, and their hind legs would beat up the paint. So in my case, not only the sheetrock work, but just repainting is something extra that not part of the routine maintenance, but something you might want to be prepared for, refinishing your stands and cleaning up the salt creep on that kind of stuff. I used the opportunity to change the color of my house after 15 years in this instance. So worked out well. I never did get that salt creep cured. What I finally did was use black silicone and sealed the frame of the tank to the glass. I wasn't able to get to all of the frame, but surprisingly, the salt creep has never come out of the two spots I've done it that I wasn't able to silicone. So somehow the 90% silicone job did the trick. I never did figure out why it was rotting the house away. Fortunately, between the silicone and the new overflow box, it's been pretty good for the last couple of years. Um, Part of the routine maintenance that I don't count as a routine that is necessary occasionally is trimming back your corals. With SPS, especially, they grow fast in some cases. This one here I call Lost Soldier because it was given to me. It was an old Worldwide Corals piece that they were selling 6 or 7 years ago, and a friend gave it to me, and I forgot the name. So it grows well over an inch a month when it's happy. And as you can see here, it's taken over this whole area. There's a little Miyagi tort that's down to the right. Another tort that's similar species, slight color variation, but this one was growing so large it actually shaded those two out and killed them. So I harvested it, and then I had to plant these back in its place. That little blasto was always there, and the coral that's down on the lower right, that's that large one. So I planted it a little bit lower, so hopefully it can get less light and less flow and slow down its growth a little bit, so I'm not forced to harvest it quite so often. It grows more than I can actually supply the local fish stores with. It's not attractive enough that people want to buy it readily. So another part of the maintenance that I do that I don't call routine is retire equipment. The calcium reactor on the right was 11 years old, running on the original pump. And I decided I got a good deal on this used Reef Octo. So I retired the Geo 618, and people always look at me funny when they say, what do you mean you retired it? It's like, well, I don't use my equipment until the day it fails. When it's 11 years old, it's time to move it on. So I ended up selling that for $75 full of media. I mean, the media cost me more than it did to sell it, and I kind of more or less willed it on to some new hobbyists with the expectation, letting them know they would need to put a new pump on it. So not necessarily routine maintenance, but extra maintenance you need to keep into consideration. I make my own food. I don't consider routine, but part of the daily routine, monthly chores that I do with my tank. I was going to take a picture of this. This actually ends up looking a lot like Rob's food or Larry's food when it's all mixed up with a PE calinus, turns it dark red. And by doing this, I don't have to decide what to feed my fish every day. my fish get everything every day. And it's not so much my fish. I feed my system. I feed the whole system. So corals, copepods, vermetid snails, aptasia. If it's in there, it's getting food, whether I like it or not. Part of the non-daily routine is Chemiclean. We all use it, kind of like the phosphate RX, or we don't all use it. I use it. I used to be afraid. I use Chemiclean once or twice a year nowadays, whether I like it or not. It seems to just almost come seasonally for some of us. In Washington, we have a lot of pollen in the spring, and that seems to set off some things in our tanks that we have never quite figured out. But some of us up here believe that problems are seasonal with our reef tanks. So Chemiclean is another one. Reflux, fluconase, definitely not something you're going to consider doing monthly, but when you have an emergency, it's there for you. We're lucky we have these things nowadays. Aptasia treatment, nothing that I do. I don't keep that on the calendar by any means, but it's there. It's a problem that bothers and plagues all of us. And then routine cleaning. This was part of the mess when I was asked what presentation I would do was maintenance. This is not good maintenance in any capacity. Fortunately, this is my tank room, and my wife doesn't have to see that. If that was in my living room, I would be probably a single man. Again, harvesting corals. I set this Idaho grape and flower petal monty in one of my grow tanks with expectations that I was going to frag it up, and 8 months later, here it was 16 inches large. I couldn't take it anymore. So keep up on that. Piping. This is definitely something that caught me off guard recently. Was one of my overflows was draining slow. I ended up having to cut it out, and lo and behold, this was plugging the pipe. I could not break that free. I actually ended up just having to throw it out. I had to put all new pipe in. So keep that in mind as your tanks mature. And that's it. I hope that was interesting for you guys.
That was so cool.
Yeah. Any questions?
How did you fix that pipe you cut open?
I just completely replaced it. I cut it off at the bulkhead, put a coupler on, and then just rebuilt the whole plumbing from scratch. So I did put a union in there so that this next time I could just open it up without having to break the hacksaw out. So I was able, I can get in there every couple years and clean those vermetid snails out. Unfortunately, that's one part of my system that doesn't have great drainage, great flow. So it's a real slow water flow. And as you can tell, it collects detritus and
I'm shadow.
builds stuff up.
Yeah.
So.
All right, guys. So if you want to ask any questions, feel free to unmute yourselves and just ask Duane and he'll answer your questions.
Duane, I want to say your tank is so beautiful and well grown and lush. I loved it. I got so excited.
Thanks. I'm ready to come back down and start pruning on marks again. As soon as COVID's over and they let me fly readily, I want to come in there and butcher it. Mark calls me the coral butcher because I am willing to take
like a weird serial killer.
But I'm not afraid to grab into a full tank and start ripping out full colonies and start over. It's actually good for it in some cases.
Yeah, I actually learned how to use the wet saw to what were we working with, the acans?
We're cutting an acan, yeah.
Yeah, and so I mean I can help. I wouldn't put me in charge, but I can help.
Let's see if I can unshare this.
Yeah.
I'll end the presentation. And I'll stop sharing. There we go.
There we go.
Duane, you didn't show us your quarantine tank. Can you tell us about the maintenance?
I do not have a quarantine tank. I've never been a fish quarantine guy. I currently have about 45 fish in my system. The system is comprised of 6 tanks, all sharing one sump and one skimmer. I learned long ago that with the coral hobby that one water change is all I can handle. So,
I agree with that.
yeah, well, Mark reminds me I have more than one tank. I have one display tank and many tanks in the system. You'd be really surprised. 6 tanks sharing one skimmer. Every tank is its own ecosystem. Every tank has its own problems. Some grow algae more than others. My 35-gallon, believe it or not, right now has dinoflagellates. It is the only tank in the system with dinoflagellates. I've been fighting them for, probably 6 months since the last time I stripped it down sterile and clean. And it's the same water column as the rest of the system. So my 55-gallon sump LPS system tends to love to grow hair algae. So each tank is its own ecosystem. Each has its own problems. So kind of an interesting thing to think about.
You're kind of
Regardless
lucky that one problem doesn't migrate to the main reef when you have like dinoflagellates in a tank that's part of the entire water, because it's all tight.
Yeah.
All the tanks are one.
Yep. They have. You're correct. It's amazing how each problem can stay. Years ago, I had green hair algae started in the 55-gallon sump. It migrated to the display tank, and it got bad. It was clumps of 2-3 inch long hair algae throughout my display tank. I did a fluconase treatment, and I didn't even think of it. I actually did Chemiclean. I found that cyanobacteria, if left alone long enough, will start to grow hair algae, and nuisance algae can grow under the sheet of cyano. So I did the fluconase treatment, wanting to treat my green hair algae, and I did a Chemiclean treatment at the same time. The fluconase did not work. So needless to say, 3 weeks later, with a 500-gallon system, a fluconase treatment is not cheap. It's a $50 treatment. So I had to treat again. So in order to guarantee that it was going to work, I spent a Friday night with my hand in the tank with a toothbrush. I spent 6 hours with the toothbrush scrubbing and harvesting green hair algae, did the treatment again, and it worked successfully that time. I can't guarantee that the Chemiclean made the first treatment inert, but it seemed awful coincidental for me. So anything else?
Any other questions, y'all?
What do you dose, Duane?
I use a calcium reactor.
That's
for
it.
Calcium and no, that's not it. And I've been dosing Acro Power for about 3 or 4 years. The first time I ever used it, I noticed better polyp extension, and some of my staghorns they would grow a few inches and then split into 2 separate branches. I noticed that they would grow an inch and then they were bursting into 8 different branches on the tips. So for me, the Acro Power, not only did it increase the polyp extension, it seemed to increase growth speed, and it darkened and deepened my colors. They were a little bit pale and pastel. So it definitely was a coral food that my corals were using. So I've been doing that for a long time. I also I dose Kalkwasser, mostly to counter affect the low pH from my calcium reactor.
Is that done just in the evenings, or?
It's 24/7. I use a dosing pump. I dose about 3 gallons of Kalkwasser a day, and I still struggle with low pH.
Oh, wow.
How often do you have you ever had the Kalkwasser overdose and hurt your tank?
No, I have not. I've been using it off and on for my 15 years of reef keeping. I don't like it. It's really touchy, especially because if you aren't paying real close attention and you are going through 3 gallons a day, unless you have a 20-gallon Kalkwasser reservoir, it'll deplete in just a few days. So on the 5th or 6th day, your pH starts plummeting, and then your alkalinity starts dropping as well. And then your corals, they'll start years past, I used to have a lot of problems with SPS, ST ending at the base. And that was the side effect of Kalkwasser. So now I use my calendar. I top it off every week, whether it needs it or not. And I seem to be pretty successful using it. So
Yeah, you have massive growth. That is insane. That is for
like
you
I
to
said,
go in and clean your tank out once a year and the growth comes back. That is amazing, man.
I'm trying to do better and take a new approach of doing pruning of sections of the reef as opposed to tearing it all down. That 4 years ago, I removed an old standard dual overflow tank and I put in a custom 210. And the first time in my reef keeping hobby, I was able to aquascape an empty tank with no water, crystal clear. I was able to stack rocks and see what I was doing. So the aquascape that's in there now has been in there 4 years. I love the rock work. I don't want to change it. So if I tear it all down, I'm going to be stuck stacking rocks in a cloudy, murky mess. And I'm afraid it's not going to work out. So,
Yeah, I hear you. Wow.
Is there
Yeah.
any parameter that you struggle with? Anything that historically you find a hard time keeping up with?
pH has always been a struggle with me. Even when I didn't have huge calcium reactor demands, I've always had low pH. Even my tank room is a remote tank room out in the backyard, and it's very well ventilated. I've cut a hole in the wall that my skimmer takes air straight from outside, and regardless, I still struggle to keep my pH above 8, believe it or not. So nowadays, as a coral grower, my alkalinity demands, believe it or not, are bigger at night when the display tank is turned off than it is in the daytime. So the calcium reactor runs really hard. It's a huge reactor. I go through probably almost 8 pounds of media a month on top of the water changes. So a lot of calcium getting sucked up on a daily basis.
So tell us about you said you test your generator and you had all those buttons. Is it an auto switch or is it something you have to turn things off? Do you turn off the main breaker? What do you do?
That's called a generator transfer switch, and each of those dials has it's called line, off, and generator. So when they're on line, they're tied into the house, and that isolates each of those breakers from the power grid. So when I'm using the generator, it's completely switched off. It's not automatic. The generator has an electric start. You have to go out and fire it up, and then those 10 switches is a bonus side effect for the family of me having a reef tank, because we have lights. It keeps the refrigerators cold, the router, mostly when my son was little. The Wi-Fi and internet was very important to keep a small child entertained when we had power outages. So I learned that the Xbox is very important. Now that my son is 17 going on 18, when our power shuts off, he's firing that thing up within 5 minutes because he learned how it benefits him. So, but yeah, so it's not manual. It was pretty easy to install. If you have an electrical background. Otherwise, you would surely want to hire an electrician to do that for you, unless you're a pretty good do-it-yourselfer.
Yeah. So what media do you use, Duane? Now that 2 fishies is pretty scarce.
I'm
Greg, one
I
second.
buy it by the 44-pound box. Sorry, Jose, go ahead.
Kevin had his hand up. Sorry, Drex.
Oh,
He's on mute.
That's all right. I was just going with the flow. I was going to ask if you had any solar batteries, but you can answer Drex first.
I do not. I have 0 battery backup at all. And for calcium reactor media, yeah, I use the Reborn. I bought 44 pounds of it, probably a year and a half ago. And when I top off my reactor, I use a lot of the coral skeletons. I didn't put that in the presentation, but typically when I'm cutting coral, I end up with probably a 20% attrition rate. So if I were to, like, say the large purple staghorn that's to the right of my head, when I cut something that large, I'm just going to take the 10 or 12 best tips. The rest of it just goes into the recycle bin. and then that becomes calcium reactor media, because I don't have enough space to grow out 100 frags of purple Formosa. It would take me a year and a half to sell those on the market, so it's not worth the time. I just take the best pieces that are going to resale. I keep a little mother colony to grow in the frag tanks, and then everything in the display tank never gets touched. Everything I put onto the market is all specifically out of my grow system, unless there's something in the display tank that's just becoming disproportionate, or I'm trying to make a better flow or better real estate for a new coral. So a lot of recycled media. And I have my eyes open for some reborn, because I'm stubborn and I don't want to buy a little 8-pound bin for the price that he charges. So
You can do a group buy, but just for yourself.
yeah, I never considered that. So
Let's get a hauler from Florida all the way up to Washington. Just get a huge semi truck full of it.
Might have to hit up Julian. So one thing I failed to mention. So I have a really good relationship with one of our local fish stores, and for 10 years, I've been growing coral for them as a wholesaler for store credit. And that has evolved into me growing coral for 3 of our local fish stores regularly. And just this last fall, I actually licensed my fish tank as its own business. It's its own LLC as a coral wholesaler. I don't do retail. I don't want to compete with our local fish stores, because I think that they're very important to the hobby. So my fish tank pays for itself in that way. And the nice thing about it, someone said, well, you turned your hobby into a side hustle. I said, well, that's the difference. I don't count on it for income. It pays for itself. And I don't have to deliver to the store on any given one day. I deliver when I'm in the mood. So it's still my hobby. So
Duane,
good
when you
times.
talked about your different maintenance, I was thinking of, because I know you're a huge Apex head and you love all your gear.
Yeah, I didn't want to give them a bunch of plugs on this. This wasn't about them.
No, I just wanted to ask you, like, do you take apart and maintain like the flow meters, or do you just let them run till they die and replace?
If they start acting funny, I will take them apart and clean them, but mostly they're pretty well standalone. I have a single spare 1-inch, and the ones on the system have been there for 2 years and they haven't given me any problems. So I don't routinely open those up and clean them. I guess I could have added that into an extra, that when equipment starts looking funny and giving you weird readings, it's definitely worth checking into.
Any other questions, guys? We're going to wrap this up pretty quickly here.
Well, I have a question. Are you using LEDs or is it T5s or halides?
LED. I've been a big LED proponent since they first came out. I actually built my first 2 generations of LED back when PFO was on the market with their blue-white spectrum. I built my own multi-spectrum fixture on a small tank, incorporated it into the 210, but found it was just too big and heavy, the heat sinks necessary for what we were doing back then. I used black boxes for about 5 years on this system. But me being a lighting junkie, I was rebuilding those black boxes. I would rebuild the blue channel every year, and then I would rebuild the white channel every second year. And then having 10 black boxes got really old. I was soldering light fixtures almost monthly after a while. So I finally I switched to Radions about a year ago. And then I do have T5 on all my grow tanks along with the Radions. So I think a combination is good. Mostly it's not about the combination of lighting for me. It's about spread. When we had metal halides, we always had VHOs and real wide reflectors, and a lot of our LEDs now, as you know, just have the small puck. and that just makes that cone. So I put the T5 so it just helps reduce shadowing on the edges of the tank.
So that was some more maintenance. Replacing LEDs every year on every
Oh
light.
yeah. Well, we try to
That's
reduce
a huge
maintenance.
part of the presentation.
Well, when you know how that is the more chore all that maintenance is the more it drives us away from the hobby, and it drives a lot of people away from the hobby, having to do all that stuff. Myself, on the other hand, after 30 years of keeping fish, 30 plus years, it's part of who I am. I don't mind it. It's part of what I do. Having this reef system keeps me occupied on my free time. I love it. I don't see myself getting out of the hobby anytime soon. So,
Well, I have your generator, is it run on, is it diesel gas, run on the propane, or?
it's a dual fuel. It is gasoline and propane. So far, I bought it 2 years ago, and I haven't bit the bullet. I want to buy a 100-pound propane tank. I've done the math on it. A large generator like that will suck up about 5 gallons of fuel in about 5 hours with full capacity. A 100-pound propane tank, I think, keeps about 40 gallons of propane. Of course, it's compressed, and I can get about 2 full days, 48 run hours on a large propane tank. I just haven't spent $150 and then to go fill it up, but that's the ultimate plan.
I saw a couple of questions come up in the chat. One was, what are your annual expenses for your systems?
That's a good question. Last year, I started an income report so that I could justify to my wife that the tank was not costing us an arm and a leg, being that it's a 500-gallon system. But expense, I honestly couldn't tell you. 500-gallon system. I'm spoiled. Like I said, I'm a fish store supplier, and I guess to be candid, last year the tank made over $13,000 in store credit. That's more than it needs. That's why I licensed it, as I can't spend $13,000 at the fish store. I don't need that much equipment. You can only buy so many fish, and I'm pretty full on coral already. So
You could have got half a peppermint angelfish.
tank this size, I pay 10 cents a kilowatt hour. Cost me about $100 a month in electricity alone. So I do know that much. So it's $100 a month. So my wife doesn't know that the tank was built in the house when we moved in. So that's been part of the electric bill since we literally moved into this house. So it was never a shock when I got into the hobby.
Yep, that saved you a little bit there. A little bit.
Yeah. Well, you know how
Duane?
spouses can be.
Oh, any DC pumps being used at this point?
I do not know. I don't find that they're that much of an energy conservation, quite honestly. And then the extra power brick is just extra space. I've set up some apexes for a few people, do a little bit of tank maintenance on the side. I try not to, but I've seen enough DC pumps. I see that the power consumption off of power bars and stuff, they do save electricity, but it's not so astronomical that I want to go out and spend hundreds of dollars and replumb my system to do it.
And they cause a lot of heat too.
Yeah. Both my return pumps are external. I'm happy with them. They're noisy pan world pumps, but since I have a remote tank room, they do the job. I actually have 3 spares on the shelf in the garage, so if one dies, I'm ready to go. So.
Oh, do you have any webcams pointed at your tank that we can log in and view your tank even when you're working?
Not anymore. I have a couple private home security cams that I can use to monitor the tank if I get an email alarm, but I don't have any worldwide webcams. I find that they're difficult just to keep the static IP. They get outdated, and it's just not worth for me to spend the money to go that route.
Of all the maintenance you do, which is the one you want to do the least?
Lately, cutting coral, believe it or not. So, the maintenance I like to do least, honestly, is cleaning my frag tanks. It's an annual chore that I do. It's something that's important and necessary. They start growing, acrylic just grows a coralline algae like crazy, and the frag racks actually start flaking off large sheets of coralline algae, and it builds in the bottom of the bare bottom tanks. So rather than siphoning it out, it's easier just to break the tank down, clean the racks over, and start out. And that's a great way of just clearing out detritus and nuisance algae, everything else to begin with. So
One question was, what app do you use to track your tanks?
I use Apex Fusion.
Oh, Jose, you were so close.
Finish this session. We don't need it anymore.
Oh, I guess you're done, Duane. We gotta go. Bye.
Okay.
That's great.
We run out of time, or was that the answer that killed the whole system?
People are logging out. They're like, bye.
Uh,
Now, he was hoping you would say, oh, I love Reef Trace.
I downloaded it. Since I don't test regularly, I have the Apex Trident nowadays that data logs everything. I just, like I said, I've become lazy. I've become complacent. Like I said, it's important. I calibrate all my probes and try to keep up on everything, but I don't do manual testing anymore, which is probably bad on my part.
Well, you said all your kits are expired anyway.
That's because I quit testing.
Yeah. All right. Well, Duane, thanks so much for coming on tonight and taking out time from work to do the presentation, because you had to leave work early for us, and that was nice of you because of your time zone. And DFW Master, I just want to remind you guys, we'll have another meeting next month. It's on a Wednesday night again. The calendar is on the website, so you can see who's going to speak. We've got people scheduled all the way through June, and we hope that you will come and attend these. And of course, if you miss the live Zoom meeting, you'll be able to watch it in its entirety on YouTube later on our DFW Mass channel. So thank you, and thank you everyone that did come to participate today. And we will see you guys online in the group or on the forums. Bye.
Yes, thank you so much. Bye-bye.